Good evening and welcome to New Canaan Library. I'm Susan LaPerla, the interim co-director, and it's my pleasure to welcome author Ron Beler with us this evening and Elm Street Books, with whom we partner to bring authors to New Canaan Library. Ron is the author of Raising the Curve, a year inside one of America's 45,000 failing public schools. It is a fascinating and disturbing expose of a year spent inside a fifth-grade classroom in one of America's struggling schools. In the fall of 2010, Ron took his seat in a classroom in Brookside Elementary School in Norwalk. Thus began a year-long journey observing teachers, administrators, and parents striving to provide the students with a quality education. Impeding the process and hanging like a cloud over the school was the specter of standardized tests, in particular the Connecticut Mastery Test, the results of which have far-reaching ramifications for the school and the careers of the teachers and education professionals. Ron chronicles the actions of administrators, faculty, the superintendent, and school board, and the difficult choices and often unfortunate assumptions they made about their students in order to earn their school a passing grade in accordance with the No Child Left Behind standards. Ron, the son of a teacher, has devoted much of his career to writing and reporting on youth issues. He wrote a weekly Kids Issues column for the Chicago Tribune, served as editor-in-chief of NBA Inside Stuff, a pro basketball magazine for teens, and wrote about youth sports injuries for the New York Times Magazine. He is the author of a children's book, The Super Book of Baseball, and the editor of Rising Stars, the 10 Best Young Players in the NBA. His work has appeared in Sports Illustrated, Wired, Men's Journal, and ESPN.com, among other publications. Now married to a teacher, Ron has turned his eye again on schools and education. Please join me in welcoming Ron to New Canaan Library.
Thanks, Susan. You left out one of my first jobs. In fact, my first job.
I read about it today.
Really? What was it? No. What it was my. Yes, that was my first journalism job. I delivered papers. I delivered the then Bridgeport Post, which is now the Connecticut Post, and earned more money than I did a few years later when I started writing for Westport's Town Crier about my high school. They paid me $3 a week. When you're the son of a career teacher, as I was, education is never really, it can't be far from your mind. My mother taught in the town about which I wrote, Norwalk, and at a school called Wolf Pit School. She was a fourth grader, and she'd come home every day, and I just wanted to stay away from her because I had had enough school already that day. I grew up in Westport. I went to Staples. I graduated from there. I knew I didn't want to take tests. I was always more of a writer, and that's what I started to do. When I went to college at Northwestern, and I started freelancing through a teacher I had who moonlighted as the music editor of the Chicago Tribune. I started writing for his paper, for his section. And when I graduated, I also graduated to writing for many of the publications that Susan talked about. The way I came to this story, I had gotten a column in the Chicago Tribune, a weekly column writing about kids' issues, ranging from everything from sports to how to break up with a girlfriend. And what I would do is I would go into a classroom, and I would pull a kid out of a class, and he was amazing, or she was amazing, because week after week, these kids gave me great stuff. I mean, I had spent a long time, a lot of my career, interviewing movie stars, politicians, athletes, and they all have a Rolodex of answers that they just want to spill out at you. But kids, if they trust you, they'll open up and bleed for you. And more than anything, what I learned, a kid wants to be listened to. And when a kid finds a grown-up who actually says, hey, I want to know what you think, you got it. I mean, they'll give you everything that they have. And so that began really what I've done today, which is to focus my career on youth issues. I began this one really because of my wife back there, Carol. She's the speech pathologist at Brookside, the school I wrote about. And yes, Carol. You know, that was better than getting a singer for her birthday at the restaurant. Yeah. And she's, you know, I had been a Little League manager. I had done an awful lot with kids. And I had edited, you know, magazines that dealt with kids. And she said, why don't you get involved in our school mentoring program here? And I thought that was a great idea, and so I did. And I started mentoring troubled boys at her elementary school. And I continue to do that to this day, and I've been there for, I can't remember, 6 or 7 years now doing this. But it was through my time mentoring that I got to learn the principal, I got to learn many of the teachers, I got to know a lot of the kids, their parents, and I came to have an investment of some sort in that school in Brookside. And what was always strange to me, what didn't compute, was that Brookside was a, quote, failing school. In fact, it was for No Child Left Behind. Failed every year to this day since the test has been administered. But it didn't seem like a failing school to me. The principal was a remarkable man who had come from several schools in Massachusetts, bad, troubled schools, each one of which he had turned around. And he had come here for 2 reasons. One, because he had maxed out on his Massachusetts pension, and he wanted to start over and get a new Connecticut one, but he wanted another challenge. He wanted a school that was struggling. And boy, Brookside, if ever a school was struggling, it was. At the time he took over, there was fractiousness on the staff. There had been a principal who had just split everything. There were maybe 8 of the 35, 36 teachers who supported the principal, and the rest were Ginner. And that set off a schism in the faculty as well, to the point where one day, you know, the 8 who supported her were pretty much ostracized. And one day, one of those teachers brought into the teacher's lounge a big wheel of brie, threw it on the table with a note that said, "For the 2-legged rats in this room." And that's really what the school was about at that time. Their scores were tumbling. This is back in 2002. Parents were really upset. Teachers weren't working together. Every classroom door was closed. Mr. Hay comes in, and he's an innovator, and he's a risk taker. And he's the kind of guy who, when he was a teacher, because that's how he started, one day a 2nd grader came up to him in the hall and said, "Mr. Hay, why don't you smile more?" And he could have blown it off, but he thought about it, and he said, "I'm sending a bad message when I walk down this hall to the teachers, to the kids." And he would practice it in front of the mirror, smiling. He did everything he could do to promote the school. He would hold a reading contest. If all the kids read X number of books, if they top what we've asked them to do, I will sit on the roof one day in spring and read the entire day. One day, when I was there to up morale, to have a fun day, what he did, he ordered sumo wrestler suits. And he and the assistant principal got dressed up in these humongous things like this, and they had a sumo wrestling match in front of the entire student body. He also brought in programs such as the Readers and Writers Workshop from Columbia University. He was an innovator who would take his money, would hold his money, and he's a big believer in technology, and he would buy smart boards when nobody else in Norwalk was. In fact, Norwalk principals at that time, back at in the early 2000s, didn't even know what to do with them. And he'd say, well, can I have yours? And he'd bring them in, and soon he had one in every single classroom when many classes didn't have any at all. He would come in the morning and go through his email, and then start scrolling the internet for education sites. And he'd email them to his staff saying, try this. And, his frustration was always, well, most of them won't look at it a second time, but at least they'll have it in the file, and maybe a couple will look at it. But he was willing to try everything, and he told his staff, he said, I don't care if you fail. I want you to try. And when you find something that works, spread the word to the rest of your teachers, the rest of your colleagues. The first day he was at Brookside, when this school was totally in the tank, nobody knew anything about him. And he got up and addressed them, kind of like I'm addressing you guys now, and said, this school doesn't have a very good reputation. And the teachers are going, what kind of new guy is coming in here? And he said, we've got to do something about it. Every year we talk about, we got to lift our students another 10% higher. Well, we got to lift you guys 10% higher. And we've got to get you holding these kids to a higher level. And a fourth grade teacher raised her hand. She'd never met him before, and she said, Mr. Hay, I don't know if those kids are ready for that. I don't know if our kids can do that. And he said, a kid will rise as far as you push that child. If you set a bar here, that's as far as that child will succeed. If you put it up higher, they're going to go for that higher level. They're going to go for that higher bar. And that was his philosophy. And that's how he ran the school. And over time, the teachers who didn't quite fit in with his philosophy, they retired, they shifted careers, they went to another school, and he started to gather a team of people who started to really act as a unit. And but when I got there in 2010 to do this thing, he had one of the probably the best literacy specialists in Norwalk. He had a great gym teacher who had taught about nutrition. He had a librarian who had never been to college herself and had always felt badly about it, especially when she started to raise her own children. And to get them to read, to encourage them to read, had started volunteering at the library herself and pretty much taught herself library science and learned the Dewey Decimal System and was finally hired for the job and came to know the library so well that when a child would say, Mrs. Madden, I'm looking for a book on Thomas Jefferson. And she'd say, well, go to that shelf. It's got a blue cover, and it's about yay thick. And the child would go, Mrs. Madden, how do you know? And she said, I've been touching books for 18 years. When you touch them that long, you get to know them. That's the kind of people that were at that school. And it struck me, how could you call that a failing system? So I went to Mr. Hay, and I said, look, I would like to come in and study what you're doing here and study what a failing school is, what we define as a failing school to be. I had another motive too. I wanted to provide a window for parents to see understand their children's lives. I mean, every day our kids go off to school. What the hell do they do there? What happens in school? Myself, doing my reporting, I had been in and out of classrooms, but not for any sustained period of time. The last time I did this book based around one fifth grade class. The last time I had been to a fifth grade class for any sustained period of time was when I was in the fifth grade. I wanted to know myself. So what I did is I made him a deal. I said, in return for the unfettered access I'll need to do this, and that meant going to any classroom at any time, sitting with any teacher, attending curriculum planning sessions, sitting with the speech pathologist. Well, I can do that anytime at home. Sitting with the literacy specialist, when she would be working one-on-one with a kid, going to teachers' meetings, meeting with parents, going to PTO meetings. In return for all that, I volunteered to be a free teacher's aide, which he gratefully and willingly accepted, that school not having many assets to begin with. Every kid I wrote about, I used that child's name, except for 4, and 1 teacher. I only used their names after getting written permission from their parents. And in one case, a kid whose parent gave me permission, I did not use that child's name because I didn't want to embarrass the child. I changed one teacher's name because she was the butt of a joke and I didn't see any reason to embarrass her. And one teacher's name I didn't mention because she was one of the weaker teachers on the staff and I didn't want to embarrass her either. Everybody else in this book exists. They're there. And the one person who's not in my book is me. And there's a very good reason, I think, for that. I don't hold a degree in education. I'm not a master of education, whatever. And I'm no expert in the field. And if I had put my opinions in the book, those experts would have laughed me off the stage. But I knew they could never laugh the people I wrote about off the stage. And so what I tried to do was capture them as close as I could to reality and to write about them with feeling and with commitment and with depth. And I got to know these people quite well. If you read the book, one of the things that really amazed me was how serious the people I wrote about took the book. At one point in the middle of the year, one of my main characters, a girl named Marbella, she's, a decent student if she wanted to be, but that year she didn't really care about school. She hadn't cared about school for a couple of years. She was into being social. Well, I'll get into talking about No Child Left Behind and test prep and all that kind of stuff later. But in the middle of this test prep, her teacher had made it known that it was important that she do well on this test, that everybody do well on this test for the good of the school. And she felt a lot of pressure. And she happened to sit next to the smartest boy in the class, and she copied his test, which the teacher found out about when he marked the papers and found, the exact same ones right and the exact same ones wrong. Now, the teacher never told me about this. Marbella never told me about this. The assistant principal never told me about this. Her mother did. And her mother did because she said, Ron, at the beginning of the year, we said that we were going to tell you everything. We were going to be honest with you. And that was the kind of cooperation I got from these people, and that's why I still feel so deeply about them. The first thing that I learned, one of the first things I learned when I got there was how little teaching time there actually is in the day. A school day is about, in elementary school is about 6 hours. But once you subtract lunch and music and snack time and recess and gym and bathroom breaks and transitions between classes, you know what you're left with for academic teaching? About 3 hours and 45 minutes. You've got to be really efficient at what you do. And it's not easy when you have 22 kids, not all of whom want to learn simultaneously. And this is the second thing I came to learn, that what teachers do is really pretty remarkable. They're good. You know that old canard, those who can do, those who can't teach. Well, that never sat well with me, having my mother having been a teacher and having taught myself at the college level. But what I came to realize was that when my mother went to school, there were basically two professions an educated woman could have. She could be a nurse or she could be a teacher. So my mother was a frustrated lawyer who became a teacher. Now, she came to love teaching and devoted herself to it. But that's not what she wanted. The people who are in school today, by and large, this is their passion. They've wanted to be teachers all their lives, and it's all they've wanted to do. And it comes out in remarkable ways. The assistant principal at Brookside, the year I was there, when she first started, she was a 5th grade teacher. One day, she gets a new kid in her class, a Mexican boy who speaks very little English. And she quickly realizes that a 5th grade teacher does not have the skill set a 1st grade teacher does in teaching the basics of reading and writing and comprehension. She had no idea what to do. But she wasn't gonna just let this kid rot in her class. She took her prep periods, and instead of preparing for class, she would go and sit in on a 1st grade teacher's class and kind of audit her class and watch how she taught kids to read, and became so fascinated with the process that when that teacher retired that year, she petitioned for and became a 1st grade teacher. To this day, she can't get enough of seeing a kid read his first words or write his first sentence. That's the kind of, and time after time, that's the kind of person I saw. The literacy specialist, she first wanted to be a teacher when she was 7 years old. And she asked her parents for a Hanukkah gift. And it was what she'd been dreaming about a year. What she asked for was a slate blackboard, just like the ones they have in school. And she taught her older sister, and she taught her dolls, and she taught her friends. And she was a latchkey kid. Her parents ran a restaurant, a deli in Westchester County. And she was self-motivated. And so she knew how to study, and she went through school and got her degree and went back to grad school and got her master's in education and started teaching in 3rd grade in Stanford, and then came in to Norwalk and became a literacy specialist. But her main goal was she wanted to teach other latchkey kids, like the kids she had gone to school with, who perhaps didn't have her motivation. And what I learned was, a school is like any small business. Brookside's got maybe 50 employees. It's like a small factory. And in any small company, you're going to have some performers who are way up here, right? And you're going to have some who you wish you could boot out the door. And most of them are going to be somewhere in the middle. And schools are no different. Most of your teachers are somewhere in the middle. Michelle Rhee now talks about how every child deserves a great teacher. And she's absolutely right. Every child does deserve a great teacher. But we live in the real world. And just like every factory owner can't have a great person at every position, a school can't necessarily do that either. But the one thing that I never saw, good teachers, average teachers, poor teachers at this school, I never saw a teacher quit on a kid. And that's important, especially in elementary school. Because in elementary school, I sat in this class virtually every single day for the entire school year. I mean, and since I was a teacher's aide, I was assisting the teacher with their education. And what I saw was that I could never be a teacher because I don't have the patience. I mean, particularly in elementary school, if you're going to succeed, not only can't you give up on kids, but you got to, because you are so many things, because that child is in your class all day, you've got to be teacher, mentor, uncle, parent, older brother or sister, confidant, confider, all these things. And most of all, you have to convince these kids that you have their back. Because if you can't do that, they're not going to follow you. And an elementary school kid, in high school, if you don't like your teacher, you're probably mature enough to say, all right, this teacher sucks, but I got to learn this stuff, and he or she can teach me what I got to learn, so I got to suck it up and listen. An elementary school kid can't do that, not mature enough. So you can have, as Michelle Rhee wants teachers to have, the greatest preparation in how to teach reading or how to teach science or how to teach civics or whatever. But if that teacher can't connect, it ain't going to happen. And believe me, I know that from experience because although I ended up in a 5th grade class, I sat in on many classes in many different grades throughout Brookside. I sat in, the teacher who I never named, I sat in on her class and I was so bored to tears I almost fell asleep. And if I fell asleep, or almost fell asleep, teacher, not quite, if I was almost falling asleep, what about those children? That's what they're up against. That's what they're battling every day. How can I engage these kids? And that's what they do, and that's what fascinated me, and that's what impressed me about the school. So I wondered, where are they falling behind? One day this year, and this is after I finished my work there, one day this year, the very first day of school this year, as they do every year, the kindergarten teachers at Brookside issued their incoming students an academic readiness test. Are you ready to begin school? There were 8 questions that the kids had to answer. 4 of them were these. Do you know how to spell your first name? Can you count to 10? Do you know the difference between an uppercase or lowercase letter? Can you trace 4 basic shapes? 38% of those kids failed one or more of those questions. If a child is failing before he or she ever steps a foot in the school, how can you blame the school or its teachers? You know, it's a funny thing. I saw in the paper the other week in the Stanford Advocate, there was an article about the highest performing schools, high schools in the state. And Greenwich was number 1, and I can't remember what New Canaan was, but it was way up there. It was like, what was it, 5 or 6 or 7, something like that? Yeah. Darien was one, okay, but Greenwich was up there too, somewhere close. Anyway, 15, not too shabby. You know, both Norwalk's high schools are failing. The year I was there, not Norwalk High School, Norwalk High and Staples, that's not Norwalk, that's Westport. Quite a different world. Quite a different world. And and you know what? You know, you have to wonder, why is this? Part of the reason is because there's a lot of social and economic problems that those kids face that people here don't. There are a lot of transients in that school. There are not that many kids that are there from kindergarten or pre-kindergarten through 5th grade. There's a lot of kids who come from single-family homes, who live with their grandparents. There's a number of kids whose parents don't speak the language. The kid I mentor has Mexican parents, a Mexican boy. He was born here. His parents came here in 1999. That's 14 years ago. They have yet to learn the language. This child will go through his entire school career, however long that may be, and I'm not sure how long it will be, without ever being able to go to his parents and say, Mom, Dad, can you help me with my homework? You know, it's a different world. It's a different world out there, and that school is 5 miles from here. After I read that article, I went online and I looked up the demographics of a couple of towns, among them New Canaan. 50% of all households in New Canaan take in $200,000 a year or more. In Norwalk, 33% of households take in $40,000 or less. It's a big difference. It's a huge difference. And it comes down to what a school can provide. They were so short of assets the year I was there that in the spring, one day after about 2 weeks, I noticed that the flagpole had been at half-mast every day. And I went up to Mr. Hay and I said, who died who's worth 2 weeks? And he said, no one. The lanyard broke. It cost $3,000 to repair. We don't have it. That's where, that's where they're at. Mr. Morey, the teacher who I followed, who's a wonderful teacher, an inspired teacher. He might have had an easier time than some of the teachers in school because he was one of the 3 males, and those kids weren't used to having males. And unlike the female teachers who nurtured kids, he actually treated them at or above their age, and he demanded stuff of them. And he was tall, and he had a deep voice, and he commanded respect. And because he has 2 young children himself, one in 4th grade, one in 2nd, he knows all about kid culture. He reads their books because he reads them to his kid. He watches their movies and TV shows. He listens to their music. And so he's able to relate to these children in a way that maybe many teachers are not able to. And he's creative enough, like Mr. Hay, that he was successfully able to engage kids who may never have, who, when I walked in, had never been engaged before. One day early in the school year, he assigned them to write an essay about a memory that they had had. Something that they had done. He said it could be, you could write it about gym class. It could be about your favorite music group. It could be about soccer. The kids sat there. Huh? And, they'd write a couple of lines and go, oh. They weren't able to do anything. He went home as he often does, and he was trying to figure out, how can I engage these kids? How can I get them to act? How can I get them to want to learn? And as he always did, he always came back to the same thought, which is, if a kid is gonna absorb a lesson, it's got to be through something he or she is interested in. So the next day he comes into school, and on the board he draws what looks like a Sherlock Holmes style pipe. And he puts X's, 5 X's around places on the board. And he says, see that X there? That was my home. That's where I lived when I was your age. And one day we had a pretty big backyard, and it bordered on some woods, and I took a hatchet and I chopped myself a BMX trail, and I went around there every single day. And this X over here, that was my friend Joel's house. And they had a big side yard, and there was a street light right out on the street, and there was a floodlight in the side of the house, and we'd play football there every night. And he said, boys and girls, there's stories all around you, everywhere. Think of your neighborhood. Think of your family. Think of this school where you spend so much time. And those kids, for the first time that I had seen, they actually put pencil to paper, and they wrote more than 3 lines, which is what they usually did. At the beginning of the year, they would write, I would see kids write 4 lines and stop and shake their hands because they were exhausted from writing so very much. And what he was doing was trying to give them stamina and trying to teach them kind of through the back door so that they would want to learn, so that they were doing something they wanted to do. He would tell, and when he was doing this, when he was telling stories about, his childhood memories, I looked out at the kids and they were fascinated. It was like listening to campfire stories, only it was their teacher telling them, and it was like they were learning about their teacher. And over the course of the year, through repetition, through things like this, they became very close. At the end of the school year, when they said goodbye, one of the girls started crying, and he did too. I mean, that's how close they were. There were a couple of things that struck me about this school and about why it doesn't work and why people don't think it works. I think it works. Here's where I think it works. I talked about bringing you up to a certain level before. Well, everybody in Connecticut's got to take the CMT. We all know that. Now, the CMT sets a bar right here. Now, parenthetically, I might add that the CMT for proficiency, and teachers and schools and school districts teach to proficiency. In fact, teaching to proficiency has nothing at all to do with grade level. It's lower than grade level. So then when our kids are, quote, succeeding because they've passed the CMT, that doesn't mean they're at grade level at all. That's one of the shames of what we're doing. And that's true here too. In fact, when the CMT was introduced, it was introduced by Gerald Tarazi, who was the State Commissioner of Education back in the early 80s. He had come from being superintendent of the New Haven school system, which was like Norwalk, worse, like Hartford or Bridgeport. And he wanted to lift the ability of underprivileged schools, of rural poor schools, to start to score. And so he, like Mr. Hay, decided he needed to get the state to reach for a higher standard. And the Connecticut Mastery Test was named specifically because that was its goal. mastery. It wasn't proficiency, it was mastery, what we would call goal on the CMT, which is one level above. And initially that's what that's what the goal of the test was. And in the early 90s, Connecticut was among the highest performing states in the nation on national standardized tests because that's where the level was. Then came No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind standard was different. It was down here. It was proficiency. So whereas Connecticut schools had been up here teaching to mastery, all of a sudden they dropped down and they started teaching here to proficiency. And that damaged everything. That damaged not only, because it didn't make schools pass. Schools were in enough trouble as it was. But those who might actually perform higher weren't helped because they had no incentive to learn. What I saw, what was the crime of what I saw, was that it was like I had attended 2 different opening days of school. The first day of opening school was in September, and it was just like all of you guys remember. You know, you meet your teacher, you get your books, the teacher selects, you know, you have your textbooks, but then the teacher gives extra reading material and personalizes his or her instruction. And sometimes in social studies, the teacher will act out a piece of history so it will come alive for the students. And it's great. And it's exactly the type of liberal arts education we want our children to have. Then came January 2nd, the second first day of school. That was the first day of school back from Christmas break. From then on until March, when the CMTs were given, through the CMTs, 9 weeks, 22% of the school year, that's a big number, 22% of the school year, Brookside kids put away their textbooks. They put away their curriculum. They put away some of the subjects they studied. Instead, they picked up guides that had been designed to train you to pass the CMT. They're study guides, the same type that you used yourselves when you were prepping as kids for the SAT or for the GRE, right? And kids were taught, if you answer this question in this way and follow exactly these steps, you will get the answer right. As we know, there's more than one way to get to an answer, and often there's more than one correct answer. But for those 22% of the school year, for those 9 weeks, kids weren't taught that. They were taught a template. But it got worse than that, and more serious than that. Because the school was failing, it devoted every energy it had to what can we do to pass. And so the literacy specialist, who is honestly tremendous in her field, she really is, she came upon a plan. One year, Brookside came within 1 student of passing the CMT. Finally, well, it didn't happen. Next year, the scores went back down. People were giving up, and Mrs. Schaefer came up with an idea, and she went to Mr. Hay, and she said, "We're close. We can get over the hump with just a little bit." And what she proposed was to take 6 kids from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades, and she would take them out of class for a half hour a day. These were kids on the cusp of passing. And she would work with them for half an hour a day, and hopefully, after 9 weeks, she would have scaffolded them enough that they would be able to pass the CMT. It's an interesting idea. It didn't work in the end. The school didn't pass. But what was lost in this plan and the school's overall plan? Well, who didn't get services. For the CMT, when you're going to pass the test, you're teaching to that middle. Those are the kids who are going to pass. And to the kids on the cusp, those who might pass. Who gets left out? Those on the very bottom, because they have no chance in the world of ever passing. So why devote any time to them? And why devote any time to the kids on the top end? They're going to pass. We don't have to worry about them. It gets worse than that. Mrs. Schaefer had spent a lot of time working with one child who had struggled with reading since first grade. He was in second grade now. And she worked with this kid every single day. And I sat with her, and I watched her work with him. And it was fascinating. The kid would get stuck on a word, say, and there'd be a picture in the book of an elephant, and the kid would be stuck on it. And she'd go, do you see a smaller word within the word elephant? And the kid would say, yes, I do. I see ant. And once he had that, he could pronounce the rest of it. And he started to be able to read. Now came test time. She could no longer work with him. Why? Second graders don't take the CMT. And for those 9 weeks, she only worked with borderline third, fourth, and fifth graders. So no first graders or second graders at all got the benefit of her service. No third, fourth, and fifth graders who were so remedial that they could never get up there, they didn't get service. None of those kids who should have been moving forward rapidly, they didn't get service either. But it gets worse than that. Not every course, not every academic course is tested on the CMT. That year, that was the year before science was tested. Social studies, civics, whatever you want to call it, has never been tested. So for those 22% of the school year, for those 9 weeks, those kids got virtually no science, got virtually no social studies. They maybe got science once a week. They maybe got history once a week. They're getting a skewed education because they were being taught to the test. Now that sounds like an onerous word, an ugly word or phrase. And the truth is, we should be teaching to the test. I mean, the test is supposed to be aligned to the curriculum. And if you're teaching the curriculum, if you have a good curriculum and you're teaching to it, those kids should succeed. Kids were failing. They still weren't getting there. They were being taught. Why? Remember, we were talking about how disadvantaged so many of these kids are, how far behind they are. And remember, I told you about the 38% who had failed going into kindergarten. Now, this is where we get back to where I had my hand up here about 15 minutes ago. If this is proficiency, kids in New Canaan, in Westport, in Greenwich, in Darien, in many schools around the country, they have parents who are helping their kids out with reading, who are doing the flip cards with math and multiplication. They know their basics. They're ready for school. So they're starting here, right? So you only got to go that far to get to proficiency. The problem is, in Norwalk, those kids are starting here. So they've got to go a whole lot more to catch up to where the kids in this community are. And the fact is, and this is why I have trouble with what is a failing school, is the kids in Norwalk were and are succeeding at the same rate as the kids in this town. But since they started here, they're only going up here. Whereas the kids here started here and they're going up there. And they're never going to catch up because of all the disadvantages that they have. And that's the shame. And that's the shame of testing, the way it's done today. We can talk about this because I'm going to open up this up for questions in a little bit. But my thinking is, if if the goal of the test is to make sure a school in a district is doing its job and not judging the kids, because back in 1985, when the test was first drawn up, individual kid scores weren't even broken out. That wasn't the point. The point was, is a school doing its job? And if it's not, how do we get it to do better? A school like Norwalk. Well, if it were me, how do you judge a school? You judge a school doing its job by its finished product. I would test just in the 5th grade. That's the finished product for elementary school. Just in the 8th grade. For middle school, that's the finished product for there. And I would test all the core subjects, not just reading and writing and math and science for the 5th grade, but I'd add science for the other classes and social studies, civics. That way there would be no incentive to wipe out the other courses. You'd still have a balanced education. The other two things that I learned, the most important thing I learned though, the most important, most impactful thing of all was that, and I think we really need a national discussion about this, is that parents need to step up and do their bit. Because without a parent's help, that child is never, ever going to be able to achieve his or her potential. A school has a kid 6 hours a day, and an energetic teacher will be there before school willing to work with a kid. And I saw Mr. Morey, the teacher I worked with, meet with kids before school, reading to them, having them read to him, after school. But the rest of the time, where are they? They're with you guys. They're home. And, it's not just the non-English speaking parents who are the issue here. It cuts across all races, all demographics. How many folks come home after a long day of work and they're just beat and they just want to eat dinner and sit down and watch a ball game on TV or Dancing with the Stars, and they don't read with their kid, and they don't have their kid read to them, and they don't get out the flip cards to work multiplication problems? That's where our problem is. Yes, I'm the son of a teacher, but I watched for a year at this school, and I saw what teachers are up against and what they do, and I applaud them. And like I said, even the ones who aren't the greatest, I never saw one quit. And if parents did the work that teachers do, our kids would perform to the level that we all hope. Thank you. Would you guys like me to read a brief thing here from the book? Yes? You're not required. Also, I have to put on these glasses. I'm getting old. All right. I've talked to, you know what? I think I'm going to introduce you to the girls. This book pretty much follows the experience of two girls, one an African American and the other Hispanic, who's her father is Panamanian, her mother is Colombian. They are best friends, but very different types of students. One tries very hard. She's not that great a student. The other isn't that great a student either, and she doesn't try at all. Both of these girls, from the beginning of the school year, were on Mrs. Schaefer, the literacy specialist, watch list. When she was trying to determine who should I pick for my special class, these kids that I'm going to scaffold up so that we can save the school, these were the two kids who were fighting for the last spot in 5th grade. And she spent the year watching them. She spent the year, all fall watching them, all fall consulting with their teacher on how well they were doing in class. And so I thought I'd let you get to know them. So this is the first day of school. Marbella didn't have any choice. Much as she didn't want to, she had to get moving. Outside her bedroom door, she could hear the bustle of wake-up activity. Her 3 older sisters were already padding about, getting ready for the first day of school. Downstairs, she could hear the refrigerator opening, the clatter of silverware on the kitchen table. Her mother was fixing cheese and ham omelets for breakfast. Her father, who owned a small but successful landscaping business, was long gone. Rubbing her eyes, the slender, dark-haired 10-year-old made her way to the bathroom. She couldn't help but stare at the enormous poster of Justin Bieber taped to her sister Melanie's bedroom door. Both Marbella and 11-year-old Melanie had a serious thing for the teen singer, whom Marbella referred to as my love. Marbella's own room was filled with Bieber posters, CDs, dolls, and fan magazines. She pulled on a short-sleeved top and shorts. The day promised to be a scorcher, sunny, reaching 93. On her way downstairs, she glanced at the tiny alcoves snuggled between the banister and a window overlooking the street. A week earlier, a potted plant had sat at its center. Now it was pushed to one side. A white work desk and matching chair now occupied the space. The desk set was brand new. Her mom and dad had placed it in the alcove, thinking Marbella would be better able to concentrate on her homework there. Last year, in 4th grade, she'd done her studying at the kitchen table amid a hubbub of barking dogs, chatty sisters, and mom preparing dinner. At the moment, the desk was empty save for a pair of decorative pen and pencil buckets and some knickknacks arranged on shelves mounted on the rear of the desk. Soon, perhaps that very afternoon, it would be crowded with homework and books. Marbella liked the look of her new workspace, if not its function. She wasn't the world's most dedicated student. 4th grade had been a poor year academically for her. She'd begun the school term reading at an as an entry-level 3rd grader and had progressed very little. Her problems had run the gamut, from fluency, the ability to read with pace, pronunciation, and consistency, to comprehension. Part of the trouble had been her class. 6 children, including 2 rambunctious boys, Chandler and Carlos, had proved expert at pushing their teacher's buttons. The teacher had been relatively inexperienced. When discipline had broken down, and it had broken down often that year, Marbella and her 2 best friends, Hydea and Asia, had been quick to pile on. In that classroom, you would really had to stay focused if you wanted to learn. That had been the other part of Marbella's problem. She hadn't seemed convinced of the importance of school. Around Marbella's house, her take on education was a minority view. Her parents, naturalized citizens, her mother a Colombian, her father a Panamanian, who emigrated to the United States in the 1980s, hoped all 4 of their daughters would attend college. Melka, 19, their oldest, was already enrolled at the local community college. Mary Rose, 15, and Melanie, both dedicated students, were expected to follow. Mom, who had dropped out of school in the 9th grade to give birth to Melka, had since returned to class to earn her high school degree. All worried about Marbella. According to Melanie, the only consistent way to get her to do her homework, even housework, was to bribe her. Marbella's standard fee for housework chores, such as washing the dishes, sweeping the kitchen, or cleaning the downstairs bathroom, was an ice cream. For those, Dad paid, but he was rarely home when Marbella returned from school. In his absence, Melanie, studious and hardworking, felt obligated to step in. If Marbella didn't want to do her homework and just wanted to go straight out and play, I would tell her, "Do your homework and I will give you $1, she said. I had a little box full of dollars and I would give her one. Marbella might not give her best effort, but at least she would complete her assignments. That morning, Marbella climbed into her mom's SUV and headed to Brookside, less than a mile away, on an uncertain note. She had hoped to be assigned to Mrs. Keefe's 5th grade class. Mrs. Keefe had a reputation for handing out cookies and candies and for throwing lots of parties. Both Melanie and Mary Rose had her, and each spoke of how much fun Mrs. Keefe had been. Marbella's mother could have requested Mrs. Keefe for her youngest daughter, but didn't think it necessary. "I just figured she had my other girls, so Marbella would have her too," she said. Instead, Mr. Hay had assigned her to Mr. Morey's room in an effort to control her behavior. Mr. Morey was 6'3" and had a deep voice. Marbella had never had a male teacher before, and she wondered what he would be like. Tough, probably. On the bright side, Hydea and Asia were in her class again, as were Chandler and Carlos. Across the street from Marbella and 12 houses down, Hydea was antsy to get going. She didn't need anyone to wake her up for the first day of school. Still, the tall, lanky 10-year-old African-American couldn't believe the summer was already over. To Hydea, it seemed like fourth grade had never ended. For the second straight year, she'd been forced to attend summer school. Her teacher had told her it was to improve her reading. Hydea knew she was behind. So did her grandma, a retired insurance clerk who worked for years in the Norwalk Public Schools central office. They just didn't realize by how much. According to Mrs. Schaefer, the literacy specialist, midway through fourth grade, Hydea was reading several steps below Marbella at a low third grade level. But her case was a little different. Hydea tried hard. Too often, though, she just didn't get it. She'd read a paragraph and struggled to explain it orally. Marshaling her thoughts on paper was even more challenging. Still, while Hydea's fluency was below average, it wasn't low enough to place her on Mrs. Schaefer's watch list. For a while, the girl had sneaked by. But as fourth grade had progressed and discipline in her classroom fractured, Hydea had started fooling around and her effort had declined. At that point, her teacher had recommended her for summer school and Mrs. Schaefer had become involved. I had to test any student going to summer school, Mrs. Schaefer said. That was when I really took a look at her. She was shocked by the result. The girl had regressed to reading at a high second grade level. That July, Hydea had paid the price. Every weekday morning for a month, she had reported to Jefferson Science Magnet School, another school in the district, where she had plowed through a long fiction book. She couldn't recall the title or make much sense of the plot. And now it was time to start fifth grade. It seemed to her she'd had almost no vacation. Hydea rolled out of bed and placed Snuggles, the stuffed red bear with whom she sleeps, atop a shelf, where it shared space with two other stuffed bears, a Bible, a music box, and a stuffed monkey named Jizzle. The cuddly red bear was a long-ago gift from her late mom, who'd suffered from a congenital heart condition and had died from complications after undergoing surgery when Hydea was 3.5 years old. Back then, she and her mom and dad had lived in Atlanta. Hydea still wasn't sure why she'd moved to Norwalk shortly after to live with her grandmother, her 17-year-old half-sister Billy, and her 21-year-old half-brother Shane. At first, she had felt so overwhelmed she had barely talked with her siblings. Now Grandma's 5-room rental apartment, located on the first floor of a subdivided single-family home across the street from a pizza parlor and 2 doors from a church social center, was home. Hydea dressed and shuffled past her homework desk, a faded piece of furniture opposite Billy's. Upon it was a tape dispenser, ruler, stapler, an adding machine, and a jar of green-stemmed ballpoint pens that bloomed at their ends into exotic plastic flowers. Framed citations attesting to her participation in the district's annual science fair hung like diplomas on the wall. To the right was a fishnet sack filled with books, including Junie B. Jones and Her Big Fat Mouth, the grade 3 level title she was currently reading. To the left was a flat-screen TV that she and Billy shared. The TV and a computer crammed into a nook in the front hallway got a lot more use than the books. Over the summer, Hydea had briefly grown excited about reading and had registered for her first library card. Grandma took me and said to the librarian, "We're looking for some books for my granddaughter." And then she took us upstairs and through a door where there were lots of books, Hydea said. But after a second visit, she stopped going. She couldn't really explain why. "I guess I mostly like to play," she said. Hydea had mixed feelings about returning to school. She wasn't looking forward to another year of reading and math, another subject that gave her trouble. But she was excited she'd been assigned to Mr. Morey. Her friend Chandler knew lots of graduating fifth graders, and all had reported that the tall athletic teacher was nice and didn't give much homework. She walked to the sidewalk to catch her school bus. Oh, pshaw. Let me pick this up. Okay. I welcome your questions. Come on, class. Sir.
I just have a small question about the high schools in Norwalk.
Yeah.
I believe there are two.
Yes.
Are they about the same in performance, Brian McMahon?
Both failing. Or so-called failing. Again, you know, where they're behind in elementary school, that distance isn't easily made up. Which is why, actually, to me, one of the smartest things that the president said in his State of the Union address was to talk about the imperative need for quality preschool education for all poor and middle class kids. Study after study has shown that if you're that first and second grade, those are the formative building block years of a child's education. And it's much easier to take a remedial kid at the first or second grade level and lift that kid to grade level from there than to wait until fifth or sixth or seventh grade and try to lift that child at that point. That is a big mountain to climb. It is one of the reasons why Norwalk's school system is so dysfunctional. They don't understand this. In the last budget shuffling, roughly $4 million was cut from their budget. 80% of that cut went to elementary schools, just the opposite of where it should be. One of the things that they lost at Brookside right now, their school library is shuttered every other week. No kid can go there. No kid can take out books. Now, if you think about it, you come to understand that an elementary school library serves a far different purpose than this public library or a high school or even middle school library. When you go to this library, when a student comes to this library or goes to a middle school or high school library, that student is going there primarily to research a topic for a paper, something. The sole purpose of an elementary school library is to place a book in a child's hand, often for the first time. The kid I mentor, his parents have no car. He can't walk to the library. The only library he has is the school library. If those kids don't have access to reading, how are they going to succeed? How are they possibly going to succeed? That's what there's so many things that are kind of hidden behind the curtain that go with all these cuts, that go with how we teach our kids that we never see, that are hugely impactful on how our children learn. This is one of them. It's probably more than you wanted to hear. Sir, you had a question.
Yeah, what do you hope to accomplish with your book?
Well, a couple of things. One, teachers when they read this book can relate to they know what I write is basically telling what their lives are. And if there are any teachers in this room, I'm sure you'll agree with me. But who drew up No Child Left Behind? Was it teachers? Or was it politicians? Was it people who really don't have a lot to do with the school system in the first place? It's not even the state or our politicians. How many members of your Board of Education spend quality time in the public schools? When are they seen? I know in Norwalk they're not seen. They aren't there. And I'm sure in many towns, and not just the poor ones, they're not there either. What I wanted to do is to draw a picture of a struggling school and what it has to do in order to, face up to the daily struggles it faces every single day because of the challenges brought on by whatever testing. Now, no child left behind, but Common Core test is going to be no different. You know why? Because it's still going to be a competitive test, and schools are going to be measured and punished by how well or how poorly they do. And until you take that punitive aspect out of it, it's going to be all about the teachers and the administrators and the district, and not very much about the students. Most kids in Brookside believed that their CMT scores were going to show up on their report cards. They don't count. Those are for the school, for the administrators, for the teachers. So I want to hold feet to the fire. I want people to read the book, like I said before. You could laugh me off stage, but these people here in my book are real as can be. And what they go through can't be denied. And I want people to read and validate that. Beyond that, I want parents to understand what school is for their children. Because maybe if they understand what school is for their children, they'll be more involved with their children's lives and their children's education. You know, I don't know how effective your PTO is. Anybody, any PTO members here? No. You know, there are 500 kids at Brookside, maybe 100 members, and of those 100 members, only 40 are active, and of those 40 who are active, probably 38 of them are white and middle class. And so not getting, you know, the people who really need to be involved aren't there. And part of the shame is they haven't found a way to connect the dots to get those people who really need to be on the PTO in there. PTO doesn't run schools. The PTO is an organization in, you know, every town. And basically what it's there to do is support schools through fundraisers so that they can send kids on field trips and the like. Fine. If a parent is a member of the PTO, and in most towns it's free or costs $5 or something like that, and those who can't afford can get scholarships. If you're a member of the PTO, by definition, you almost have to be more involved in the school. And if you're more involved in the school, you'll probably become more involved in your child's education. I want parents to read this book and get involved in their kids' lives. That's what I want. Yes, sir.
Is there a fear factor among the teachers themselves? Because if, for example, if their motivation is to make sure that the CMT is the essence of their product, you might say the product of determining the excellence of their work. If the fear factor is there and they're pushing to make the kids meet the CMT because they fear for their jobs, perhaps they would be fired, or they would be demoted, or they would get less of a salary if they did not make sure the kids could match the CMT requirements.
A couple of years ago, there was a high school in Rhode Island. Every teacher was fired. Now, could every teacher have been so awful? Here's an interesting thing. Sometimes Mr. Hay, he's like 60, he's 63 when I wrote the book, so he's 65 now. He's never going to have another job. This is where he's got 2 more years and he wraps it up and goes home to Massachusetts. But sometimes, out of curiosity, he will kind of thumb through principalship job openings in Connecticut. And he'll come to one and he'll go, 95% white students, they all passed the test. You know, you never even have to think about the school dealing with the CMT. I wonder what that world would be like. And he says he thinks to himself, you know, I wonder about the kids in those schools. I wonder how well they do without their teachers. Probably a lot of them, because of their parents, are pretty well motivated. But I know in our school, our teachers have to be there. They're essential because our kids don't have that underpinning. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, but I'm going to give you another answer to it too. One, yes, as I said, some live in fear of being fired. And in fact, what was it, last year? Either last year or the year before, Bridgeport, the Board of Ed actually went and requested that the state take it over because it was such a disaster. Yeah, that can lead to many firings. The other thing, though, is boredom. Teachers, the only way to make the job interesting, where it becomes fascinating, is a teacher's teaching style is like a fingerprint. Every teacher has a unique style, developed, weaned over years of time. And a teacher will teach that same way. And a teacher will always strive for creativity. And the reason a teacher will strive for creativity is because the challenge is, how do I reach those kids today? Because every class is different. And, one year you might have a bunch of kids who really want to learn. Another year you might have stick in the muds. And another year you might have a bunch of annoying brats who disrupt things. And it's always a challenge. How do I make this class work? So by its very definition, it's a creative work. It's a creative profession. Teaching to a template leaches all the creativity from their job. It makes them bored. And they leave, one, because they want more money, two, because they're overwhelmed with paperwork, three, because they're bored. They get tired of what they're doing because they're not allowed to do what they love, which is to impart education to their kids in the way that they know how that resonates with them. That's why they leave. Yeah.
What do the unions think about the tests?
The unions nationally have kind of agreed. I mean, a lot of, the national unions have come out and said, we think teachers should be held, more accountable. We think they should, not more accountable. We think they should be better trained. We think they should be having, tested on their skill sets. We think they should have continuing education. And that's all good. But myself, what Mr. Hayth says is that it takes 5 to 7 years for a teacher to learn his or her craft. Right now, tenure is given after 4 years. That doesn't make any sense. If most teachers don't get it until further down the line, why would you give tenure then? I'd wait. I'd wait on tenure till maybe the 6th year, maybe the 7th year, whatever. Kind of like law school does, law firms do. And that way, you know that a teacher is committed, and you know when a teacher has a skill set that you want in your school to teach to your kids. That's what I would do. Any others? Class? Yes.
Well, by the same token, you mentioned early childhood ed.
Yeah.
And I just think, a teacher, the job is just overwhelming with all the various levels and learning issues and all kinds of things. But I think across the board there needs to be more parenting.
Yeah.
Parenting. And I think the country has to be educated in it, like it did with no smoking, This is
Yep.
what a good parent does, and this is how your child should spend his time once he gets out of school. And putting him in front of the TV or the video games is not the answer. Oh, yes, he's out of your hair, but that is not the best thing for him.
I agree. That's what I wrote about and what I talked about. I mean, especially in a school like Brookside, where you have, a very challenged student body. The year I was there, 59% of the kids were Hispanic, 21% white, 18% black. But the key number is this: 59% their families were sufficiently impoverished to qualify for free or reduced fee lunches. They had no advantages, no economic advantages. And where that comes out is these kids have limited experience, limited dreams. They come from homes where there aren't newspapers sitting around on the dinner table. There aren't any news magazines. They don't watch the TV news. They don't know much about nonfiction. Their dreams, even their dreams, are truncated. In this community, kids dream about the Ivy League. In Norwalk at Brookside, the dream is, I'll go to the community college, I'll go to NCC, because that's as far as they can imagine. They don't have siblings or parents who have gone beyond that. So that's as far as their imagination goes. Think if that was all, I mean, not that NCC is bad. You know, it does a good job for what it does, but is that the extent of your dreams? There are a lot of kids there in that school because of their lack of car, lack of money. They've never been to a zoo. They've never, except on class trips, never been to a museum. This is how limited they are. This is what they're up against. You know, it's 5 miles away. And, you know, it's easy. I grew up in Westport. Believe me, I didn't go to Norwalk when I was a kid. It's easy to ignore it. But we ignore it at our own peril. We do. Anything else? Okay, 20-minute essay on what happened here. No, it has been my pleasure and my honor to talk with you tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.